Launched in 2015, Nvidia's GTX 980 Ti stood on top of all gaming graphics cards. But in 2023, it can be found for £80 to £100 on the used market. But does this make it a good deal, or should it be confined to the history books? Let's find out in today's video, because I've done some benchmarking. The 980 Ti is the pinnacle of Nvidia's Maxwell architecture. It was the most powerful graphics card amongst that family of GPUs, and it had the performance to back it up. Thanks to its 2816 CUDA cores, which excelled gaming performance, and it was even good for maybe some even light 4K gaming at the time. Also, the 6GB of GDDR5 memory was absolutely massive for the time too, as most graphics cards were shipping between 2 and 4GB of VRAM, so 6GB was a nice addition on this graphics card. And all this could have been yours for the price tag of $649 US. This is what they launched at, and nowadays that would get you a mid-range card, something like a 4070, something around that sort of range of graphics card performance, let alone a flagship GPU which costs like 1500 quid now, which is kind of ridiculous. Nvidia also actually did some forward thinking with the 900 series, unlike the 600 and 700 Kepler series of GPUs, and that's because these support DirectX 12.1 at a feature level. This ensures that all the newest games will run on a 900 series card for the most part. Back to the 980 Ti though, and this is the model that I've been testing. It is a reference cooler, but it's got a EVGA hybrid shroud on it. Let me tell you now, this isn't a hybrid GPU. It's got no water cooling at all, but I believe it's the actual cooling assembly from a reference card, just with the shroud of a hybrid. So it will perform exactly the same as a regular reference card from Nvidia. And let me tell you now, this thing runs hot and loud. It's just ridiculous how loud this thing runs. It doesn't sound too dissimilar from a jet fighter or a coal rolling diesel truck. Yeah, it's not pleasant to have in your gaming PC, if I'm honest, and if you're looking for a 980 Ti, I'd recommend a aftermarket cooler, something that has actually got fans on the front of it instead of having a blower style. All testing today is done on my test bench system, which has actually been upgraded recently, which I did in a previous video, which was the 16 versus 32GB video. I've decided to keep the Corsair Dominator DIMMs in the test bench as it does give out better gaming performance, and I thought you obviously want as much performance in a test bench. So the specs of it are a Ryzen 5 5600G, 32GB of dual rank, dual channel, 3200 MHz CL16 memory, and a Sabrent 1TB NVMe Gen 3 SSD. All testing today is done at 1080p, as that is the resolution I'd recommend for the 980 Ti, especially in 2023. It doesn't really have the horsepower to push past that now, and the VRAM would be a pretty big concern at 1440p, and even in 1080p in some titles as well. First up today is Fortnite, and here it defaulted to DirectX 11 instead of DX12 for some reason, probably because the 980 Ti is getting on a bit now, so we tested it with DX11 here today just because it probably would perform better anyway. But I use my typical settings, and that is the low preset with epic textures and a far view distance, and this turned out to work pretty well with the GTX 980 Ti, getting 171 FPS on average with 109 FPS for the 1% low. Fortnite felt nice and smooth, nothing really to complain about here, and these are the settings I would recommend if you've got a GTX 980 Ti or something similar. Next up is F122, and I haven't bought F123 yet, but they'll probably perform very similar anyway, so I wouldn't be too worried if you've got F123 and a 980 Ti in your system. Here I set it to the medium preset, which still looks relatively decent if I'm honest, and this got 123 FPS on average with a 1% low of 90 FPS. Yet again, this was done in the West Australian Grand Prix benchmark, which is a worst case scenario for the game, and 123 FPS on average is not too bad, and with the 1% lows being at 90 FPS as well, it's nice and smooth, there's hardly any hitches, and it's some great gameplay right there. Next up is one I haven't tested for a while, and that is The Witcher 3. Here I set it to the medium preset with DirectX 11, and this game actually did receive a pretty substantial update quite recently. It was at the end of last year, and I made a video on that when it came out, but essentially the whole game has kind of been overhauled. But here, with the medium preset and DirectX 11 being selected for the API, which does enable a bit better performance on the 980 Ti, it got 97 FPS on average with 61 FPS for the 1% low. So you could probably get away with the high preset here, if I'm honest, and get 60 FPS around that figure, and you still have a very smooth gameplay experience. This was done in the Novigrad Square, which is probably the most intensive part of the game, so yeah, yet again, this is a worst case scenario for The Witcher 3. Modern Warfare 2 does kind of run alright on old hardware, but here today, the GTX 980 Ti was okay in this title. It wasn't particularly brilliant, it wasn't particularly bad. Because I set it to the basic preset with high textures, because that 6GB of VRAM does enable high textures, and I recommend enabling them if you've got the VRAM to do so, because the game just looks a lot better in my opinion, looks a lot less muddy. But here it got 79 FPS on average with a 1% low of 45. The FPS does tend to drop quite a bit when smoke effects are on the screen, so that is what contributed towards the slightly lower 1% low. But then again, performance is fine. I'd probably recommend setting it to the minimum preset with high textures for this game. Forza Horizon 5 is a game that doesn't really run that well on older hardware, but if you've got anything sort of modern, it's not too bad, and the 980 Ti is considered to be pretty old at this point. However, with the high preset enabled in the in-game benchmark, the GTX 980 Ti got 61 FPS on average with 50 FPS for the 1% low. Performance here was nice and smooth, and 61 FPS is a similar to an Xbox Series S level of performance, so it's not too bad. It looks pretty decent with the high preset. The game was recommended the medium preset, but with 61 FPS in Forza Horizon 5, which is a casual gameplay experience, I don't think that's a bad figure at all, and these are the settings I would recommend with the 980 Ti. Horizon Zero Dawn is up next, and this is a game that actually surprised me because the 980 Ti actually performed relatively decently in this game. Albeit it was on the original preset, but it still got 80 FPS on average with a 1% low of 57 FPS, especially for a game which is known to use a lot of VRAM because it uses pretty much all the 10GB on my RTX 3080 when it's maxed out at 1440p. The VRAM on the original preset wasn't too bad. Yes, it doesn't look particularly amazing by any means on the original preset, but it still doesn't look terrible at all, and 80 FPS on average is very playable indeed, and these are the settings I'd probably recommend playing Horizon Zero Dawn at. Cyberpunk 2077 is a game that did not surprise me at all, if I'm honest, and that's because on the medium preset with high textures, which the 980 Ti can do, it only got 43 FPS on average with 33 FPS for the 1% low. There's something with older GeForce cards and Cyberpunk which just don't get along well. Even Pascal cards don't perform that well in Cyberpunk, so I don't know what's going on here, but I expected this. So yeah, Cyberpunk, it's playable, maybe drop it to low and you can get around 60 FPS, but performance here certainly isn't ideal. To contrast from Cyberpunk, Rainbow Six Siege is just that one game that will literally run on anything. It will run on an Intel integrated GPU just fine. And here on the Ultra preset, the 980 Ti got 172 FPS on average with a 1% low of 120. Yet again, performance here was nice and smooth with no issues to report here. And if you've got a 240Hz 1080p monitor, I'd recommend dropping to maybe medium or even high, and you should be getting quite a lot of the graphical fidelity, and you should be getting the frame rate as well. But then again, if you're playing this game competitively, you're probably going to be putting everything onto low. Battlefield 2042 is up next, and this is a more CPU demanding game than it is a GPU demanding game. But here I set it to the absolute low preset, which to be honest doesn't look that different from medium or high from what I've seen. So yeah, you're not really losing that much graphical fidelity. However, it got 85 FPS on average with a 1% low of 57 FPS, and I believe this is actually quite a good performance figure. Battlefield 2042 isn't an easy game to run by any means, and the 5600G in my test bench was working pretty hard, but we were still above 95% GPU usage, so we was certainly GPU bound in this title. So yeah, Battlefield 2042 is certainly playable on a 980 Ti. Last up is GTA 5, and the PC port for it launched in the same year as the 980 Ti, so I want to see how well, after a few updates, GTA 5 is still getting on with the 980 Ti. Here I set it to the very high settings, it's not really a preset, and I also enabled 2x MSAA as well, just to clear up some of them jagged lines. You kind of need MSAA at 1080p because it just makes the game look a lot better. But here, it got 91 FPS on average with 67 FPS for the 1% low. This performance is totally fine for GTA. It's a story game, it's not competitive, even if you're playing online as well. So 91 FPS on average here is perfectly fine, and a 1% low of 67 FPS means it's also nice and smooth as well. So yeah, GTA 5, it's going to be playable on a 980 Ti. It's going to be playable on GPUs a lot worse than this as well. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much. So the GTX 980 Ti performed relatively decently, I guess, in most games tested today. Games like F122, Rainbow Six Siege, Fortnite, and even Horizon Zero Dawn actually did impress me with the performance. But then again, we come to games like Cyberpunk, which just do not like older graphics cards from Nvidia. I don't know why this is. Anything older than Pascal just runs very poorly with Cyberpunk. So yeah, if you're wanting to play Cyberpunk or any newer games, I'd recommend going with something newer than this. But overall now, this thing is 8 years old, almost to the day actually. So yeah, this performance from an 8-year-old card, albeit it was the highest end one from 8 years ago, is still pretty impressive if I'm honest. But then again, if you're paying a price premium for a 980 Ti in 2015, you've probably upgraded that come around the 2080 Ti perhaps. And you've probably upgraded that 2080 Ti to a 4090 by now. So yeah, if you're paying premium prices, because 650 quid was pretty premium back in 2015, you're going to be expecting premium performance, and this thing no longer offers premium performance. It's very entry level now if I'm honest, but that's still pretty incredible considering its age. So if you've still got a 980 Ti in your gaming PC, or you could find one for a very good deal on the used market, and you play games like Rainbow Six Siege and stuff like that, to be honest, it's probably a bit overkill for Rainbow Six Siege, but it's still a very good GPU for games like that. And this brings me on to my final recommendation with the GTX 980 Ti. Do I recommend you go out and buy this in 2023? And I'd have to say probably no, and that's because there are better deals to be found than this. Look at GPUs like the GTX 1070, it's newer, it consumes less power, and it also has 2 extra gigabytes of video memory. This can be very important in newer games as they are using a lot of VRAM these days. Not only this, it will run quieter, it will run cooler because Pascal is just way more efficient than Maxwell. And you'll also need a lower wattage power supply. I think 500 will do it for a GTX 1070. For a 980 Ti though, you need at least a 600 watt. Or even, you could save up a tiny bit more and get something like a used RX 5700 XT. The used value on them things are incredible right now. I used to have one in my PC and I want to actually pick one up used because I want to see how it's getting on in 2023. So if you want to see that, make sure you stay subscribed, like this video, and let me know in the comments. Also, if you're looking at this price point and this performance point too, you could look at something like a 1660 Ti. That costs around, I believe it's a tiny bit more, it's around £113, £110 used, but you can find a good deal on one, and it will use half the power of a 980 Ti, and it will give out roughly the same performance, all while having much better features like a better NVENC encoder, so if you're streaming or recording gameplay, that's kind of a no-brainer right there. And it's got much faster GDDR6 memory too. Don't get me wrong though, the 980 Ti, it's still I wouldn't say a beast, but it's aged pretty well actually, all things considered. It's just not a premium graphics card anymore, and it probably wasn't premium as soon as the GTX 1080 Ti come out, because that thing absolutely overshadowed this graphics card when it released. Speaking of that, I will be making a video on the 1080 Ti, which should be dropping next week, so if you want to see that, make sure you stay subscribed. So overall then, I'll have to say that the GTX 980 Ti is still a relatively decent 1080p gaming graphics card, especially if you're playing older titles, but I think its time has come and gone. I think it should be confined to the history books now, and Yeah, but as long as it's still giving out great gaming experiences, and it's still pushing out them frame rates, and it's still being supported by Nvidia, because the drivers are still coming out for this thing, even though it's 8 years old now, I think it still deserves to be in a gaming PC, but then again, there are better deals to be had out there. So with that being said, I'm going to leave this one here. If you like this one, like it, stay subscribed for more tech content, and I'll catch you in the next one.